A finding that would upend all medical science's preconceived notions about the human mind was made in the fall of 1867, deep in the coal mining districts of western Pennsylvania. Respected Dr. Edmund Blackthorne, who had cared for injured troops during the Civil War, came across a case so remarkable that he spent the following 3 years recording every detail in diaries that would be kept secret for more than a century. The subject was 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell, whose skills went against every medical theory at the time. It was not his looks that set Timothy apart. His sandy brown hair and sparkling green eyes, which seemed far too knowing for his age, made him look like any other child of his generation. Nor was it his background. Born into a low-income farming family in the hills outside of Pittsburgh, Timothy had gone through the same struggles as many other post-war kids. Timothy Caldwell was unique because of what transpired in his head when he touched someone else's skin. Prior to us, I have a crucial question for you, as you delve deeper into this amazing tale that will make you reevaluate everything you believe you know about human consciousness. Investigating the most enigmatic and unexplained instances in American history is the focus of this channel. Tales that have been buried, forgotten, or purposefully kept out of the public eye. You belong here with us if you think that history has mysteries we're just now learning, and that truth is stranger than fiction. Click the subscribe button to become a part of our truth-seeking community. Since these puzzles can be found all throughout our country, please let me know in the comments which state you are viewing from. There has never been anything like the Timothy Caldwell case in the history of medicine. The most thorough investigation of psychic phenomena ever done by a qualified medical professional was carried out by Dr. Blackthorne for 3 years. His conclusions, which were recorded in more than 400 pages of careful observations, would affect our comprehension of awareness in general. However, Timothy's abilities aren't the only thing that makes this situation exceptional. When the 1860s scientific elite understood the consequences of these discoveries, they attempted to stifle them. The narrative starts in September 1867, when Timothy's father, Marcus Caldwell, took his kid to the Millfield Clinic of Dr. Blackthorne. Marcus was an elderly man in his 40s. Years of laboring in the coal mines left his hands permanently blackened. He exuded the silent despair of someone who has tried everything else before turning to assistance. Since he was 6 years old, Timothy had been going through what his parents referred to as episodes. The youngster would abruptly stop whatever he was doing during these periods. He would start talking in voices that weren't his own and roll his eyes back. However, these were not the haphazard words of a frantic mind. Timothy would recount talks between strangers, events occurring miles away, and information about strangers' lives that turned out to be frighteningly true. The youngster was said to be demon-possessed by the local preacher. The town doctor had recommended bed rest after diagnosing nervous weariness. He had been treated with electrical therapy and tonics by a wandering medicine man. Nothing was successful. The episodes were growing more regular, if anything, and more unsettling. At first, Dr. Blackthorne treated the situation with the skepticism of a man who has studied logical medicine. During his years of practice in Pittsburgh, he had witnessed his fair share of neurological problems, hysteria, and what he called theatrical madness. After studying Timothy for a few minutes, however, he became aware that he was dealing with a situation completely unrelated to his medical background. During what ought to have been a standard physical examination, the first occurrence happened. Just as Dr. Blackthorne was taking Timothy's pulse, the boy's face abruptly transformed. When he spoke, his voice had the accent and rhythm of an old woman, and his vivid green eyes took on an air of distance. Timothy uttered, "My name is Margaret Thornfield," but his lips hardly moved. The White House with the blue shutters was where I resided on Elm Street. Robert, my spouse, died of consumption last winter. The fact that young Sarah has the same cough that killed her father worries me the most out of my 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. The hair on Dr. Blackthorne's arm stood on end. Timothy had never been to Elm Street, which was located just across town, and he had never heard of somebody named Margaret Thornfield. However, he decided to look into it because of the boy's emotion and the clarity of the information. Everything changed when he found out. The actual Margaret Thornfield existed. She resided in a White House with blue shutters, just as Timothy had described. It was true that her husband, Robert, had passed away from tuberculosis the winter before. Sarah, one of her 3 children, was exhibiting early signs of the same illness that had claimed her father's life. The majority of Margaret had, astonishingly, never met Timothy or his family. She was unaware that the most personal information about her life had been somehow accessible by a small boy across town. This was only the start. Dr. Blackthorne recorded scores of such events over the next few weeks. In a matter of seconds, Timothy would start channeling information about people's lives, secrets, anxieties, and hopes after touching them. He recounted early recollections that no one had ever discussed. He disclosed latent illnesses that had not yet shown signs. He described historical events with the precision of someone who had been there to see them happen. However, Timothy was capable of far more than just reading people's thoughts. He started talking in the voice of a man named Colonel James Morrison, after one especially strong episode, vividly recounting his experiences at the Battle of Gettysburg 4 years prior. Timothy described particular army movements, fellow officer identities, and even the contents of unsent letters. The wife had received a letter from the colonel. However, after weeks of investigation, Dr. Blackthorne was able to verify that Colonel Morrison had indeed existed. Leading an attack on Confederate positions on the second day of the fight, he had perished at Gettysburg just as Timothy had predicted. Military documents supported Timothy's story in every way, including the regiment. Numbers in combat formations that were impossible for an 8-year-old boy to have known. The ramifications were astounding. Every religious and scientific belief of the time was called into question if Timothy could somehow access the memories and experiences of people who had passed away years before he was born. This implied that consciousness might outlast bodily death. Despite his medical background telling him that certain phenomena were impossible, Dr. Blackthorne found himself recording proof for them. Dr. Blackthorne tried to keep the case private, but word of Timothy's skills started to circulate. In the hopes that Timothy might shed light on their circumstances, families traveled from all around western Pennsylvania to Millfield with their ailing relatives. The youngster appeared to have a remarkable talent for identifying diseases that traditional medicine was unable to identify. When he touched a patient, he would instantly identify circulation issues, growing tumors, or interior damage that other doctors wouldn't notice for months or even years. In one recorded instance, Timothy looked at William Hayes, a middle-aged farmer, who appeared to be in good health. Timothy touched the man's palm and declared that Hayes had a little apple-like growth in his stomach. At first, Hayes rejected the diagnosis since he felt fine. However, he started having excruciating stomach aches 6 months later. When the surgeons eventually dissected him, they discovered a stomach tumor that was, in fact, about the size and shape of an apple. It became apparent to Dr. Blackthorne that Timothy's gift, if it could be called that, was evolving. Over time, the youngster was learning to regulate how and when he accessed these unearthly information sources. Instead of being overtaken by sporadic bits of awareness, he could now decide to read particular parts of a person's life. According to Dr. Blackthorne, Timothy was beginning to exhibit selective psychic perception. However, this increasing authority also brought unsettling insights into Timothy's actual capabilities. The young man wasn't merely channeling spirits or reading minds. In some way, he was drawing from what seemed to be an enormous storehouse of human experience that went beyond personal awareness. Timothy was able to recollect discussions from decades before, explain events he had never seen, and make startlingly accurate predictions about the future. When Timothy touched Dr. Blackthorne's hand during one session, he started talking about the doctor's experiences caring for injured soldiers during the conflict. However, Timothy's information wasn't merely true. They were more comprehensive than the recollections of Dr. Blackthorne. The youngster recalled the precise location of surgical instruments during particular surgeries, recounted talks with patients that the doctor had forgotten, and even shared the contents of letters from home that Dr. Blackthorne had received while serving at field hospitals. Timothy appeared to have obtained a flawless recording of a more exact and detailed recording of Blackthorne's experiences than the doctor's own memories. This implied that someone with Timothy's special skills could be able to obtain traces or imprints left by human consciousness. These possibilities were not anticipated by the scientific community in 1867. At the Pennsylvania Medical Society, Dr. Blackthorne tried to share his initial results with peers. He was greeted with suspicion that swiftly evolved into animosity. He was accused by other doctors of being a hoaxer or of being tricked by a child with remarkable intelligence. According to others, Dr. Blackthorne was experiencing delusions as a result of his experiences during the War. Dr. Blackthorn's determination to fully chronicle Timothy's abilities was further bolstered by his peers' rejection. He started doing controlled experiments intended to rule out any chance of fraud or chance. He employed sealed envelopes with information Timothy was unaware of beforehand, brought in other observers, and developed complex testing procedures that would appease even the most doubtful investigator. The outcomes were consistently the same. Timothy continuously shone skills that were beyond the realm of reason. He was able to describe the contents of locked boxes, read sealed letters without opening them, and give in-depth details about persons and events he had never met. Most astonishingly, over hundreds of recorded tests, his accuracy rate continuously stayed above 90%. Those who viewed Timothy's skills as a danger to the status quo, or as a chance for abuse, however, became more interested in him as his reputation increased. He was condemned by religious authorities as a devil's agent. Traveling entertainers paid high prices to display him as a novelty. Government representatives started discreetly asking about possible uses of his talents in the military. Dr. Blackthorn recognized that Timothy was at risk of being either a victim of persecution or a commodity. Overwhelmed by the attention and terrified of the consequences of their son's talent, the boy's family started to distance themselves from the public eye. In an effort to shield Timothy from anyone who would take advantage of or hurt him, they relocated from their little farm to a more remote area, farther into the Pennsylvania hills. Timothy's skills started to change during this time of seclusion in ways that even Dr. Blackthorn found quite frightening. The boy was no longer merely drawing on other people's experiences and recollections. He was starting to sway them. In November 1867, Timothy stroked the hand of Samuel Crawford, a local merchant who had come for treatment of persistent headaches during one especially unsettling session. Timothy appeared to project his own recollections into Crawford's mind rather than diagnose his illness. Crawford claimed to recall Timothy's early years as though they were his own experiences as he departed the session. He talked of talking to Timothy's parents, playing in the Caldwell family barn, and even the flavor of his mother's food. These weren't generic sentiments or hazy sensations. Crawford was as clear about certain aspects of Timothy's life as he was about his own recollections. Crawford was left perplexed and troubled by what he had witnessed, as the effect lingered for a few days before progressively diminishing. Concern over this incident grew as Dr. Blackthorn chronicled it. The ramifications were enormous if Timothy could not only read consciousness but also change it. The boy was exhibiting skills that indicated human minds were far more flexible and interconnected than anyone had previously thought. However, the ethics of Timothy's gift and the possibility of its abuse were also called into doubt by this recent development. Dr. Blackthorn's arrangement for Timothy to be evaluated by Professor Heinrich Müller, a German scientist who specialized in what he called mental magnetism, in December 1867 was the most important step in understanding the boy's powers. Müller had brought a set of devices he thought would monitor electromagnetic emanations from the human brain with him when he traveled from the University of Pennsylvania to investigate Timothy's case. After meeting Timothy, Müller's early mistrust vanished in a matter of hours. He used a crude galvanometer to find out that the boy was surrounded by extraordinary electrical activity. The readings were different from anything Müller had seen in his earlier research on human consciousness whenever he entered one of his psychic states. During his bouts, Timothy appeared to produce electromagnetic fields that changed dramatically, producing patterns Müller said resembled a communication signal. Even more astonishingly, Mua found that his equipment could pick up Timothy's electromagnetic emanations even while the boy was in a different room. In one experiment, Müller kept an eye on Dr. Blackthorn's equipment in the upstairs office while Timothy was put in the clinic's basement. Despite their physical distance from one another, Müller's devices recorded matching spikes in electromagnetic activity when Timothy started channeling knowledge about a patient he had never met. This implied that Timothy's powers functioned via a transmission of energy that went beyond typical physical limits. According to Müller's theory, human awareness may exist in part as an electromagnetic form that someone with the right sensitivity may detect and control. To a remarkable extent, Timothy seemed to have this sensitivity. The most thorough scientific investigation of psychic phenomena ever attempted in the 19th century was the result of Dr. Blackthorn and Professor Müller's partnership. Over the course of several months, their collaborative investigation recorded Timothy's skills as well as their possible mechanisms. They found that in some meteorological circumstances, especially when atmospheric pressure was low and electrical storms were coming, Timothy's electromagnetic ionations were most intense. They also discovered that Timothy's emotional and physical conditions had an impact on his ability. He became far less sensitive to psychic signals when he was sick, exhausted, or under stress. On the other hand, his capacity appeared to increase beyond even his typical remarkable range when he was relaxed and well-rested. At his best, Timothy could communicate with subjects who were miles away, describe events that were happening in real time in far-off places, and even seemed to affect the minds and actions of strangers. The fact that Timothy's skills were still getting stronger, though, was possibly the most unsettling finding. His gift manifested itself in new ways every month, surpassing his prior abilities. Dr. Blackthorne started to fear that Timothy's psychic development might not have a natural limit. The youngster may ultimately acquire abilities that have the potential to drastically change human society if his current rate of development continues. During an event in February 1868 that Blackthorne would later characterize as the most terrifying event of his medical career, the implications were evident. Timothy had been requested to evaluate Elizabeth Porter, a young woman who seemed to be experiencing serious melancholy. Timothy was hoped by her family to provide light on the reason behind her illness and offer potential remedies. Something unexpected happened when Timothy touched Elizabeth's hand. He appeared to entirely connect with her awareness rather than only read it. Timothy spoke in Elizabeth's voice for about an hour, conveying her feelings and ideas so strongly that onlookers were unable to distinguish between the boy's and her personalities. However, even more unsettling was the fact that Elizabeth started to behave and speak like Timothy, as though their minds had somehow merged. In order to break the bond between Timothy and Elizabeth, Dr. Blackthorne had to physically intervene after struggling to do so. Upon separation, both subjects had symptoms of severe confusion. Elizabeth claimed to have recollections of playing in coal mines and living in a farmhouse she owned, whereas Timothy was unable to recall his own identity for several minutes. Never observed. The event showed that Timothy's skills were starting to endanger not only himself, but also other people. It was impossible to predict what may occur if he lost control during a more powerful psychic experience, even if he might unintentionally fuse consciousness with his subjects. Dr. Blackthorne started to wonder if Timothy's ability might end up being more of a curse than a blessing. News of the Elizabeth Porter case caught the notice of Washington government authorities, who had been surreptitiously keeping an eye on rumors of Timothy's aptitudes. Colonel Alexander Grant, a representative of what he described as merely a special department under the War Office, paid Dr. Blackthorne a surprise visit in March 1868. Grant indicated that Timothy's case was of great interest to the federal government and that the youngster could be able to help his country in ways that civilian medicine would never be able to fully use. The Dr. Blackthorne's eyes were open to possibilities he had never thought about during his chat with Colonel Grant. Timothy might be extremely useful for military intelligence gathering. If he had the ability to read minds and retrieve information over great distances, he might be employed to coerce suspected spies into making confessions or even to influence enemy commanders during a conflict, if he had the ability to affect other people's thoughts and actions. Dr. Blackthorne, however, also saw that Timothy's powers offered a horrifying potential for abuse. A government with such authority may use methods that would leave no tangible evidence to snoop on its own people, rig elections, or crush political opposition. The doctor was torn between his moral obligation to shield an innocent child from exploitation and his scientific obligation to further human knowledge. Dr. Blackthorne's realization of the ethical conundrum made it even more complicated that Timothy himself was starting to realize how much he could do. Although the youngster had always been extraordinarily advanced for his age, his psychic experiences were causing him to develop intellectually and emotionally at a rate that was both startling and extremely worrisome. Few adults had the understanding of human nature that Timothy was developing, and he was learning to employ his skills with ever greater sophistication and purpose. "I know what you're thinking about, Colonel Grant," Timothy stated, glancing straight at Dr. Blackthorne during one session. The boy's words chilled Dr. Blackthorne to the bone. not only because they were true but also because of the adult wisdom they contained. Timothy was no longer just a child with extraordinary powers. You're debating whether to hide me away or allow them to take me to Washington, but you already know what the right answer is, don't you? You've seen what I can become. As spring came in 1868, Dr. Blackthorne found himself recording changes in Timothy that went well beyond his psychic powers. The boy was growing at a rapid pace both mentally and physically, and his vocabulary was growing every day as he absorbed information from the minds he touched. He was becoming something else, something that might eventually surpass the normal limits of human consciousness and capability. As he was able to access the collective wisdom of all those he met, his comprehension of difficult scientific and philosophical ideas grew astonishingly quickly. Most astonishingly, Timothy was starting to keep permanent copies of the memories and experiences he accessed, rather than merely channeling information temporarily, but creating a vast internal library of human consciousness that he could access whenever he pleased. The boy was turning into a living storehouse of human experience, with memories and knowledge that spanned generations and included viewpoints from all walks of life. During those spring months of 1868, Dr. Blackthorne saw a change in Timothy that went against every human development principle he had studied during his medical training. The boy's intellectual development was accelerating at a rate that appeared to defy the natural laws governing childhood maturation. Rather than speaking with the simple vocabulary of an 8-year-old, he now conversed with the sophistication of a university professor, moving fluidly between topics ranging from ancient philosophy to state-of-the-art medical theory. That was growing. His physical presence had started to shift in subtle but distinct ways. When he walked into a room, people were drawn to him for no apparent reason, forced to listen when he spoke, unable to turn away when he looked into those ever-knowing green eyes. Dr. Blackthorne recorded cases in which grown men would submit to Timothy's views on business and politics, treating the boy's observations with the deference usually accorded to acknowledged authorities in their domains. During one particularly memorable session, the boy looked up from the medical text he was reading, a volume on surgical procedures that should have been incomprehensible to someone his age, and made an observation that sent chills through Dr. Blackthorne's entire being. The most unsettling part of Timothy's evolution was his growing awareness of his own power. "I've been thinking about what happens when I touch people's minds," said Dr. Timothy, with a voice that seemed impossible from such a young throat. The implications of Timothy's statement hit Dr. Blackthorne like a physical blow. "It's not just that I can see their memories or feel their emotions. I'm altering them, whether I intend to or not. Every time I connect with someone's consciousness, I leave a little piece of myself behind and take a piece of them with me. We're all becoming more connected than we were before." In order to test this theory, Dr. Blackthorne started doing follow-up examinations with people Timothy had previously encountered. What he found confirmed his worst fears. If psychic connections were causing permanent changes in the consciousness of everyone he touched, then Timothy wasn't just displaying extraordinary abilities, but was essentially altering the nature of human consciousness itself, one person at a time. Those who had been subjected to Timothy's psychic touch showed measurable changes in their personalities, their thought patterns, even their fundamental beliefs about reality. A cynical merchant who had written off Timothy's abilities as a hoax now spoke passionately about the interconnectedness of all human consciousness. A deeply religious farmer who had previously thought that psychic phenomena were demonic started to doubt the soul's basic nature and its connection to the physical world. And even more concerning were the accounts of common experiences among Timothy's subjects. Strangers started to describe similar intuitive insights, identical dreams, and an uncanny Timothy wasn't just a boy with extraordinary abilities. He was potentially the catalyst for a fundamental evolution in human consciousness, a bridge between the isolated minds of individuals and some form of collective awareness that had transcended normal human connection. Dr. Blackthorne realized he was witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented in human history, the ability to sense each other's emotions over great distances. It seemed as though Timothy's psychic interventions were creating a network of consciousness that linked his subjects in ways that went beyond normal human connection. The scientific ramifications were astounding, but the social and political consequences were even more worrisome. If Timothy's powers kept growing and expanding, they could radically change the structure of human society. making it impossible to sustain governments that depended on the privacy of their citizens' thoughts, and discrediting religious organizations founded on faith rather than first-hand spiritual experience. Colonel Grant's visits increased in frequency as spring gave way to summer, and the government official no longer made courteous inquiries about Timothy's condition, but instead spoke with the authority of someone delivering orders rather than suggestions, suggesting that the entire idea of individual identity might vanish as human consciousness became more interconnected. Grant explained that the War Department had decided that Timothy represented both an unprecedented opportunity and during one especially heated meeting, Grant said, "Dr. Blackthorne, I hope you understand the gravity of what we're dealing with here. This boy has the potential to revolutionize military intelligence, but in the wrong hands, he could also pose an existential threat to the stability of our entire government. We cannot allow him to fall under foreign influence, nor can we ignore this potential threat to national security." Dr. Blackthorne's growing concerns about Timothy's future were encapsulated in the colonel's words. Whether Timothy knew it or not, his extraordinary gifts were making him a prisoner of his own capabilities. The boy was becoming too powerful to remain free, too valuable to be left alone, and too dangerous to be allowed to develop his abilities without proper oversight and control. During their private conversations, Timothy showed an unsettling awareness of the political forces assembling around him. "They think they can control me," Timothy told Dr. Blackthorne one afternoon as they strolled through the hill surrounding his family's remote farmhouse. "They think if they take me to Washington and put me in a room with their enemies, I'll just read their minds and tell them what they want to know," he said, detailing military strategies that were allegedly classified at the highest levels of government, discussing government plans he shouldn't have known about, and quoting private conversations between officials he had never met. "However, they have no idea who I am or what I'm becoming into. I can feel every mind within 20 miles of here," the youngster said, pausing at the brink of a cliff overlooking the valley below, his green eyes displaying an ancient depth of intelligence despite his juvenile appearance. "Doctor, I understand what the miners are preparing for their family, the farmers are thinking about their crops, and the Pittsburgh politicians are plotting their next elections. They can all sense me too. I'm becoming part of them even if they don't know it yet, and they're becoming part of me." Dr. Blackthorne experienced a chill that wasn't related to a mountaineer. Timothy's description implied that his psychic powers extended beyond direct physical contact. If he could affect people's thoughts and emotions over such great distances, if his consciousness was already blending with everyone in the area. In late July, Timothy had been going through increasingly intense episodes that seemed to drain him physically, while simultaneously expanding his psychic reach. And during one of these episodes, he suddenly collapsed, which Dr. Blackthorne would later describe as the moment he realized the case had moved beyond the realm of medical science into something approaching the supernatural. At that point, the boy was well on his way to becoming something far beyond human. "The boundaries are dissolving," Timothy said, his body trembling as though he were having a severe seizure in Dr. Blackthorne's clinic, rather than the haphazard movements that are typical of neurological distress. Timothy's convulsion appeared intentional, almost ritualistic. His eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed impossible from a human throat. "I remember now. I can see the pattern that connects every mind, every soul, every spark of awareness that has ever existed." His voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and his lips hardly moved. "Individual consciousness was always an illusion. We are all pieces of a puzzle that forgot it was whole." Everyone in the clinic started having intense hallucinations as Timothy spoke, including Dr. Blackthorne, who found himself reliving childhood memories with perfect clarity, while also experiencing the thoughts and emotions of everyone else in the room. The boundaries between individual minds seemed to dissolve completely, creating a shared consciousness that encompassed everyone present. The experience lasted only a few minutes, but its effects were permanent. All those who experienced Timothy's episode reported long-lasting shifts in their awareness and perception, describing prophetic dreams, feeling always connected to other people's feelings, and having intuitive knowledge about events that were far outside of their normal sensory range. Dr. Blackthorne recognized that Timothy's development was accelerating beyond all prior patterns, and the boy was no longer just the boy's physical health was rapidly declining, as his psychic powers drained more and more of his vital energy. And whatever Timothy was becoming, it represented a fundamental change in the nature of human consciousness itself. He was either accessing or influencing individual consciousness, or he was becoming a focal point for some sort of collective human awareness that went beyond the usual boundaries of space and time. Dr. Blackthorne watched helplessly as Timothy's childhood innocence was replaced by an alien wisdom that made him seem more like an ancient spirit, inhabiting a young body than a natural human being. Timothy's family struggled to cope with their son's transformation, and his mother, Mary Caldwell, spent hours sitting by his bedside trying to connect with the child she remembered, beneath the increasingly otherworldly being he was becoming. He ate little, slept poorly, and appeared to exist in a constant state of psychic communion with forces beyond normal human experience. The isolation that had once shielded Timothy from exploitation now seemed like a prison that held forces too strong for any one place to contain, and his psychic emanations were affecting wildlife throughout the region, causing birds to fly in unusual patterns, making livestock restless and agitated, even influencing the growth patterns of plants and trees around the family property. His father Marcus withdrew into himself, unable to accept that his son was developing into something that challenged every assumption about human nature and divine order. Timothy appeared to be creating fields of influence that went well beyond the electromagnetic enations Professor Miller had discovered months earlier. And the boy was turning into a nexus point where mental and physical reality intersected in previously unheard of ways. Blackthorne's documentation of these environmental effects was the first scientific evidence that consciousness might directly interact with physical reality in ways that conventional science couldn't explain. As autumn drew near, Colonel Grant's patience with Dr. I respect your dedication to scientific inquiry, but this situation has moved beyond the scope of civilian oversight. The government official made it clear that Timothy would soon be moved to a secure facility in Washington, where his abilities could be studied under controlled conditions and possibly used for national security purposes, abandoning the pretense of voluntary cooperation in favor of direct federal intervention. Dr. Blackthorne, Grant said during their final meeting that Blackthorne's scientific methodology had reached its limits. Dr. Blackthorne, who had spent more than a year documenting Timothy Caldwell's extraordinary abilities, but who had also seen the human cost of his transformation, was horrified at the thought of Timothy being taken from his family and put through government experimentation. Timothy Caldwell represents capabilities that could determine the outcome of future conflicts. We cannot allow academic curiosity or personal attachments to compromise our national interests. However, Dr. Blackthorne also acknowledged that Timothy's development had progressed to a stage where conventional notions of care and protection were no longer applicable, and that the boy was already losing himself to forces outside of his control, and that government exploitation would only hasten his disintegration into something that didn't resemble the innocent boy he had once been. The boy was evolving into something that went beyond typical human categories, something that might eventually prove beyond the capacity of the boy was either the next step in human evolution or a fundamental threat to the individual consciousness that had defined human nature since the dawn of civilization. But Dr. Blackthorne knew that Timothy's story was far from over, and that its final resolution would have implications that extended far beyond the hills of civilization. The question was no longer whether Timothy could be helped or saved, but whether humanity was prepared for what he was becoming. On August 15, 1868, Mary Caldwell was awakened not by sound but by its total absence. The usual symphony of crickets, nightbirds, and rustling leaves had completely stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something monumental. This night, which would change everything, began with what Timothy's mother would later describe as an otherworldly silence that settled over their remote farmhouse. She discovered Timothy standing in the middle of their tiny parlor, his 9-year-old body silhouetted against the moonlight spilling through the window. But it wasn't really Timothy. The boy she had carried in her womb and nursed through innumerable childhood ailments had been replaced by something that wore his face, while harboring an intelligence that seemed older than the hills themselves. When Timothy turned to face her, Mary saw galaxies swirling in his green eyes, not figuratively but literally, pinpoints of light that moved and shifted like far-off stars, making patterns that were painful to look at directly but impossible to ignore. The convergence is beginning, Mother. All the threads of consciousness that have been separated since the dawn of humanity are starting to weave back together. His voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from inside her own skull. I am the loom on which this great tapestry will be rewoven. However, the process requires sacrifices that I don't think anyone is ready to make. Dr. Blackthorne arrived at the Caldwell farm the following morning to find the entire property transformed. The familiar landscape he had visited dozens of times over the past year now seemed to exist. Caldwell had given birth to 8 children, lost 3 to illness and accident, and survived the hardships of frontier life that would have broken weaker souls. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the cosmic terror of watching her youngest child transform into something that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. Timothy was waiting for him in the barn, sitting cross-legged in the middle of a perfect circle that had been burned into the wooden floor. Trees seemed both solid and translucent, their branches reaching into places that shouldn't have been physically possible. The family's vegetable garden displayed plants in different stages of growth and decay simultaneously, as if time itself had become fluid and malleable. Overnight, the boy's physical appearance had changed drastically. Most unsettling of all, his shadow seemed to move independently of his body, creating shapes and patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Timothy said, "You're afraid, Doctor," without raising his gaze from the intricate geometric patterns he was drawing in the dirt with his finger. His hair had gone completely white, but it still had the soft texture of childhood. "I'm becoming a conduit for that field, a bridge between what humans call reality and the infinite awareness that underlies all existence." Dr. Blackthorne approached slowly, his medical bag feeling woefully inadequate. "Because you finally understand what I've been trying to tell you for months. Consciousness isn't contained within individual brains, but rather is a field that connects everything that has ever lived or will ever live." For whatever was going on with his young patient. For weeks, Professor Muller's instruments' electromagnetic readings had been registering impossible values, but now they were starting to fail completely, their fragile mechanisms unable to handle the energies Timothy was producing. "What's happening to you, Timothy?" The youngster looked up, and for a little minute, Dr. Blackthorne inquired, although he felt the response would call into question his sanity. "I'm becoming what humanity was always meant to become," Timothy said, his voice now bearing the wisdom of ages. "Before we learned to see ourselves as separate, before we convinced ourselves otherwise, Blackthorne saw not one consciousness behind those star-filled eyes, but thousands. Men and women from all over the centuries, children who had died too young, elderly souls who had passed peacefully in their sleep, all of them looking out through Timothy's face, their individual personalities somehow maintained while being part of a greater whole." The implications of Timothy's transformation went far beyond anything Dr. Blackthorne had recorded in his journals. If the boy was right, if human consciousness was in fact a part of a larger field that connected all living things, then everything humanity believed about death, individuality, and the nature of existence was fundamentally incorrect. "I'm just going back to that original state, but I'm bringing all the knowledge and experience I've gathered along the way." In the days that followed, Timothy's influence began to extend beyond the immediate area of the Caldwell farm. Dr. Blackthorne received reports of strange happenings all over western Pennsylvania, including miners working deep underground, who claimed to hear voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood. Farmers who reported that their animals had started acting with extraordinary intelligence, as if they were suddenly aware of concepts beyond their natural realm. And the most unsettling were the reports from the nearby town of Millfield, where people were having what they called shared dreams. The local pastor said that the end times were near, and entire families would wake up with identical memories of events that had never happened, conversations with deceased relatives, and visions of places that existed outside of the physical world. On August 22nd, 1 week after Timothy's most dramatic transformation, Colonel Grant arrived at the Caldwell farm with a full military escort, bringing with him a team of specialists that included not only doctors and scientists but also people whose presence suggested the federal government had been studying phenomena similar to Timothy's abilities for longer than anyone had realized. Dr. Blackthorne observed from a distance as the military convoy approached the farmhouse, noting that the horses pulling the wagons became increasingly agitated as they approached Timothy's place. And by the time they arrived at the boundary of the property, some of the animals would not go any farther, rearing and whinnying in fear at whatever it was that they perceived to be coming from the young boy. Colonel Grant's assurance vanished the instant he met Timothy directly. The veteran military officer who had led troops through some of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War, unable to look the boy in the eye. When Timothy spoke, Grant's calmness dissolved. "You spent the last 5 years trying to forget the sound his voice made when the shrapnel tore through his chest. But you still hear it every night when you close your eyes," Timothy recited in a voice that carried no emotion, despite the intimate knowledge it revealed. Colonel Alexander Grant, born in Boston, graduated from West Point in 1840, served with distinction at Bull Run in Antietam, and lost your younger brother William to Confederate artillery at Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. Timothy wasn't done. "You came here to capture me, to take me to Washington, where your superiors think they can harness my abilities for military purposes. But you don't understand what you're dealing with, Colonel." Grant staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The personal details Timothy had revealed were known only to Grant himself, secrets he had never shared with anyone, memories he had tried desperately to bury beneath. "The consciousness I'm accessing doesn't recognize national boundaries or political allegiances. I'm not just the weapon that can read enemy minds or influence their decisions. I'm becoming something that transcends the very concepts of friend and enemy, ally and adversary." The boy rose from his position in the burned circle, and as he did, reality seemed to ripple around him like stones thrown into still water. The soldiers who were with Colonel Grant started to feel the same shared consciousness effects that had been. They were reliving each other's memories, experiencing their comrades' emotions as if they were their own, and they couldn't tell where their individual identities ended and their collective awareness began. Dr. Blackthorne recognized that Timothy had progressed beyond the point of merely showcasing his abilities, and that the boy was now actively reshaping the consciousness of everyone who encountered him. The military escort that had arrived with such confidence and authority found itself paralyzed by the sudden dissolution of their individual identities, and soldiers who had obeyed orders without question for years now found it difficult to recall why they had come to this remote Pennsylvania farm. Timothy was no longer human in any conventional sense. Instead, he had become a focal point where individual consciousness merged with something vast and infinite. When they could sense their fellow soldiers' thoughts and feelings as clearly as their own, the clear chain of command that had governed their military life became meaningless. Professor Muller, who had come with Colonel Grant's expedition, tried to use his electromagnetic instruments to take readings, but the moment Timothy turned his attention to them, the devices exploded in showers of sparks, and the energies the boy was now producing were too great for 19th century science to measure or comprehend. "Your instruments are made to detect electromagnetic fields generated by Colonel Grant's carefully crafted plans," were rocked by Timothy's demonstration of his evolved ability. "But what I'm channeling isn't coming from any single consciousness," Timothy told the shaken professor, "but the combined awareness of every human being who has ever lived, every thought that has ever been thought, and every emotion that has ever been felt. Your machines can no more measure this than a teacup can contain the ocean." When the boy's essential being existed in a realm that transcended space and time, any attempt to physically move him would be futile. Dr. Blackthorne watched in fascination and horror as Timothy began to demonstrate abilities that challenged the fundamental laws of reality. The boy could not be captured or contained using conventional methods because his consciousness now extended across vast distances, connecting with minds throughout the region and beyond. Science. Things in the barn started to move without being touched, rearranging themselves into intricate geometric patterns that were painful to look at directly. The air itself appeared to thicken, acquiring characteristics that made breathing difficult while also giving everyone in the room a sense of greater aliveness than they had ever experienced. However, the most unsettling part of Timothy's metamorphosis was how it affected his physical form. The boy's body was starting to turn translucent, as though his consciousness was so strong that it was piercing the physical world. Timothy appeared to be aware of his physical dissolution and talked about it with the detached air of someone discussing an inevitable natural process. Dr. Blackthorne could see through Timothy's skin to the bones underneath. But instead of the typical structure of human anatomy, he saw patterns of light that pulsed with intelligence and purpose. "This body was never meant to contain what I'm," during one of their last discussions, he informed Dr. Blackthorne. Human forms are made to contain individual consciousness, not the collective consciousness of our entire species. I am burning through this corporeal shell like the wax being consumed by a candle flame. As their son changed into something that looked less and less like the youngster they had reared, the boy's relatives looked on helplessly. Marcus Caldwell, who had spent as August came to an end, Timothy's influence continued to spread outward from the Caldwell farm like ripples in a pond, and Dr. Blackthorne received reports of similar phenomena occurring in neighboring states. Timothy had spent his life working with his hands in the practical world of coal mining, but he was now facing cosmic forces that made his entire existence seem insignificant. Mary Caldwell held vigils by Timothy's bedside, praying to a God she was no longer certain existed in the form she had always believed. The pattern indicated that Timothy's metamorphosis was causing a fundamental shift in human consciousness that went well beyond his immediate physical presence. Children in Ohio were exhibiting sudden psychic abilities, adults in Virginia were having shared consciousness episodes, and even as far away as New York City, there were documented cases of people suddenly gaining access to memories and knowledge they had never acquired through normal means. Timothy Caldwell had become patient zero in a pandemic of consciousness that could fundamentally change the nature of human existence. He was acting as a bridge between other minds and the same collective awareness he had tapped into, giving humanity a glimpse of what it might become if the barriers between individual consciousness were permanently dissolved. Dr. Blackthorne realized that he was witnessing not just the transformation of one extraordinary boy, but possibly the beginning of the next stage in human evolution. Dr. Blackthorne's journal, which was last recorded on August 31st, 1868, described an event that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Timothy had summoned him to the barn one last time, saying that he needed to understand something important before the transformation was complete. When Dr. Blackthorne arrived, he discovered Timothy suspended 3 feet above the ground, his translucent form glowing with an inner light that seemed to come from another dimension, the air itself seeming to speak when the boy spoke as if reality had learned to speak. "Everything I've shown you, everything you've written in your journals, Doctor, is only the beginning. Consciousness isn't limited to living things. It permeates everything that exists, from the smallest particles of matter to the largest structures in the universe. I've become a window through which humanity can glimpse this truth, but I won't be the last. Others are already starting to realize who they truly are." As Timothy talked, Dr. Blackthorne felt his own consciousness growing, reaching the edges of the vast awareness the boy had been describing for months. For a brief, horrifying moment, he felt what Timothy had been feeling, the simultaneous thoughts and feelings of thousands of minds, the wisdom accumulated over generations, the terrible and beautiful truth that individual identity was nothing more than an illusion created by limited perception. The experience lasted only a few seconds, but it altered Dr. Blackthorne's life forever. When he regained consciousness, Timothy was gone. Not dead, not departed, but just not present in any way that the human senses could pick up on. The barn was deserted save for the burned circle on the floor, and the lingering feeling that something enormous and unfathomable had passed through it and gone to places that only the human mind could comprehend. The military escort that had arrived with such certainty about their mission left in confused silence, unable to reconcile their memories of what they had experienced with any rational explanation their training had provided. The official records of Timothy Caldwell's case remain sealed in government archives to this day, buried beneath layers of classification that suggest the implications of his transformation were deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Colonel Grant's expedition left the following morning, their official reports describing nothing more than a case of mass hysteria that had affected the local populace. What happened to Timothy Caldwell is more than just an unexplained medical anomaly from America's past. It challenges everything we believe we know about the nature of consciousness, the boundaries of human potential, and the possibility that reality itself might be far stranger than our limited understanding of it. Dr. Blackthorne's journals vanished soon after his death in 1891, though there are rumors that copies are in private collections of people who study the boundaries between science and the supernatural. Timothy Caldwell's story takes on new significance in an era where quantum physics suggests that consciousness might play a fundamental role in shaping reality. Perceptions allow us to understand. The question that haunts researchers who have studied this case is not whether Timothy's abilities were real, But whether his transformation represents an isolated incident or the first documented example of humanity's next evolutionary step, importance that goes well beyond the Pennsylvania coal mining hills of the 1860s, the most disturbing scenario would be if Timothy's prophecy, that others have started, came to pass. Realizing that he had similar skills, he worked in secret to escape his fate. If awareness actually surpasses the limitations we have placed on it, if human minds are more interconnected than we would like to think, then Timothy, perhaps Caldwell's legacy is showing itself in ways we're just now realizing. The youngster who couldn't be explained by science might have been revealing a side of ourselves that we haven't yet come to terms with. However, whether prepared or not, the limits between people's thoughts remain hazy. And in the human race's collective mind, Timothy Caldwell's metamorphosis keeps spreading, affecting others who are at last ready to comprehend what he became.